There was a town nestled high in the mountains, surrounded by thick pine forests that became haunted by shadows as soon as winter set in. The townsfolk called it the longest winter, a season that stretched endlessly, with blizzards so fierce they isolated the town for months. Few people outside even remembered the town's name. Those who did only spoke of it in hushed whispers. For every 20 people who stayed through the winter, one would disappear without a trace. Callie had grown up in the town hearing stories about the longest winter every year. She was a hardy local, used to braving snowdrifts taller than she was and surviving with the sparse food stores they prepared in fall. But she had always been unnerved by the stories. Every winter, the town elders would warn of strange shadows that appeared in the snow, of figures glimpsed in windows, and of a presence they simply called the frost. The frost comes for the lonely, her grandmother used to say, with eyes that seemed to glint with an unsettling memory. The longer the winter, the stronger it grows. When Callie's grandmother went missing one winter, everyone in town whispered that the frost had taken her. Her body was never found, and though Callie was only a child then, the event had haunted her all her life. Now at 25, Callie still felt her grandmother's absence with a hollow ache. This year, as she locked up her small cottage at the edge of town and braced herself for another bitter winter, that ache returned sharper than ever. The snow fell heavily the night of the first storm. It was so thick that it blotted out the world, making it impossible to see even a few feet beyond her window. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the wooden walls of her cottage, and through the snow, she thought she could hear faint whispers, like voices drifting through the wind. Trying to ignore them, she wrapped herself in blankets and huddled by the fireplace, listening to the crackling flames and doing her best to drown out the sounds. But the whispers persisted, growing louder as the night deepened. Finally, unable to ignore them any longer, she peered out her window. All she saw was a wall of swirling snow, the kind of blizzard that could easily trap a person if they ventured out. But as she squinted, a shape appeared, a figure moving slowly through the blizzard. It was tall and pale, with eyes that gleamed a haunting blue in the darkness. She thought it was just a trick of the storm until the figure paused, turning its head to look directly at her. Callie's heart raced. She backed away from the window, her mind racing with stories of the frost. She told herself it couldn't be real, that it was just her imagination. But as she turned, she heard a faint tapping on her door, as if something was beckoning her to come outside. The tapping stopped, and after several long, tense minutes, Callie finally fell into a fitful sleep. But her dreams were filled with images of pale figures, their blue eyes watching her from every shadow, and a voice calling her name through the snow, a voice that sounded eerily like her grandmother's. The next morning, Callie awoke to a town buried under feet of snow, the sky dark and gray. She shook off the dream, telling herself it was only her mind playing tricks. But as she made her way to town to gather supplies, she found an odd stillness in the air. There were no footprints on the fresh snow, no signs of life, and the houses she passed seemed empty. The town square was silent. Usually, even in the deepest of winters, someone would be outside shoveling snow or tending to a fire, but the place was eerily deserted. Callie walked through the empty streets, knocking on doors, but no one answered. She felt a chill settle in her bones as she realized that everyone was gone. "This can't be," she whispered, fighting the panic rising in her chest. She hurried back to her cottage, feeling the oppressive weight of silence pressing down on her. It felt as though the world itself had been swallowed by the snow. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder, more insistent, as if the voices were right outside her door. This time she heard her grandmother's voice clearly, calling her name. "Callie, come out. It's so cold. I'm so cold." Callie clenched her fists, her breath catching in her throat. The voice sounded so real, so much like her grandmother that she couldn't help but inch toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she hesitated. She remembered her grandmother's warnings about the frost, how it called to the lonely, luring them into the snow where they would vanish forever. Still, her grandmother's voice kept calling, filled with pain and longing. "Callie, please, help me." The desperation in the voice broke something inside her, and before she knew it, she had thrown open the door. The snow was blinding, swirling so thickly that she could barely see her own hands. But in the distance she saw a figure, a faint outline of someone standing in the snow, their arm raised in a beckoning gesture. Callie took a step forward, her heart pounding. But as she got closer, she saw that the figure was not her grandmother. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed stretched and unnatural. Its skin was a pale, icy blue, and its eyes were deep, empty pits of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around them. She froze, realizing too late that the creature had been waiting for her. Its mouth opened in a smile that was too wide, filled with rows of needle-like teeth. Before she could scream, the creature lunged, icy hands reaching out and grasping her wrists with a grip colder than death. The frost-bitten fingers sank into her skin, and she felt her warmth draining away as the creature pulled her into an embrace. It whispered in her ear, a voice that shifted between her grandmother's and a hollow, echoing rasp. "Stay with us, in the snow, forever." With a final surge of strength, Callie broke free, stumbling back into her cottage and slamming the door. Her heart pounded as she locked every window and door, the echo of the creature's voice haunting her mind. She fell to the floor, clutching her arms and feeling the lingering cold where the creature had touched her. The storm raged on for days and the whispers never ceased. Trapped and terrified, Callie huddled by her fireplace, barely sleeping, barely eating, listening to the constant voices outside. Sometimes she thought she heard other townsfolk, neighbors who had disappeared, their voices distorted and twisted as they called out to her, begging her to come into the snow. Days turned into weeks and still the snow fell, burying the town deeper and deeper. Callie felt herself weakening, her mind slipping as the endless winter dragged on. She knew that the creature, the frost, was waiting for her, lurking just outside her door, waiting for the moment she would finally give in. One night, as her strength waned and her fire began to die, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She was so tired of fighting, so tired of being alone. She closed her eyes, listening to the whispers, and finally she understood. The frost was not merely a creature. It was the spirit of the winter itself, the embodiment of the endless snow and isolation. It was ancient and patient, and it would wait for every soul in the town to join it, one by one. As her fire flickered out and darkness closed in, Callie felt the cold creeping over her. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind until she could no longer tell where her thoughts ended and theirs began. And when she finally opened the door and stepped out into the snow, the frost welcomed her with open arms. The next spring, when the snow finally melted and travelers came through the town, they found it abandoned. The houses were empty, the streets silent, and the only sign of life was the faint outline of footsteps leading from every door, vanishing into the mountains. No one knows what happened to the townsfolk, but on winter nights, if you stand very still and listen to the wind, you might hear their voices calling, lost in the snow, waiting for someone to join them in the longest winter.